here we are. The topic today is smart grid security. We will start with a short lecture today, and next week we will continue with more details. The first thing I would really like you to remember from this part of this course is that security of the smart grid is important and is not just the problem of the security experts. Perhaps some of you will become security experts, but probably most of you will not. But security is the job of everybody. It cannot just be done by experts, because as soon as we go online, like we're doing here for the lecture, like we're doing also for the control of the smart grid, then we're exposing the smart grid to security risks. Here are just two out of many, many press releases that I could find recently. Those are perhaps the most famous in the recent past. One of them is called the Aurora vulnerability. It is an example of how, as soon as something is controlled by a microcontroller or a full-fledged computer, having access to this microcontroller can create damage to the physical system. In this case, it is a diesel generator that is controlled by a computer, and gaining access to the control in a way that is not normally meant to be done can cause physical damage. In this case, the diesel generator was exploded out of the bad control that was done here. So imagine this diesel generator is part of a power system that is remotely accessed, and bad guys find a way to directly get access to the controller, then they can destroy the asset physically. Another example that's even more spectacular, I'm trying to get my pointer here it is, is an attack on an entire smart grid. This is in the context of the war between Ukraine and Russia, and some adversary of Ukraine managed to gain access to the grid. It was not a very sophisticated attack. Essentially, one attacker managed to find the credentials, the username and password of one of the technicians of the grid, logged into the system, used this login to infect, to inject malware, viruses, computer viruses, into the system, and they could do a number of destructive actions like destroying data, but also destroying some of the functions of the SCADA, which is the computer that monitors the state. And if you lose the control and the monitoring, then if anything goes wrong, you're not able to fix it. So they could create some service disruption. So cybersecurity is an issue, is the responsibility of everyone. Just like when we say to you, you can access the Internet Engineering Workshop, at least in other years when we have physical access, then we tell you, but it's also your responsibility to make sure that you lock the door when you leave the room. So that's the same thing. As technical person, as an engineer, I must make sure that everything I do cannot be used to provide illegitimate access, cannot be used to create vulnerabilities in my system. So we must be aware of what the cybersecurity mechanisms are. This is what we will see today and next week. But before getting there, I would like to emphasize that if we have a very powerful lock on your house, but if you leave the house and keep the apartment or the house open, then of course your very powerful lock is useless. So the human part is very important. Humans and policies contribute to security. For example, the attacks the last attack on the Ukraine grid that I showed before was due to a password problem. So make sure your passwords are secure. In particular, that means a number of things. Perhaps you should use a password manager or another system that guarantees that you never use the same password on two different login systems, because every login system can be corrupted once. So if gain access to one of your passwords, we should not be able to gain access to all of the systems that you use with this password. And more systems use multiple authentication steps. Your e-banking access probably does not simply rely on a password, but probably ask you to install an app, get some authentication by showing that you also have control either of a list of random numbers or that you have control of a smartphone that was registered with the app. So let's see now what is the strict minimum that every engineer, in fact every EPFL engineer, should know about cybersecurity. So we will see what cryptography and the various types of cryptographies mean and how they are used. Of course, we are not doing a security course. We will remain fairly superficial, but I hope that with this course, you will have a complete view of a correct mental model of how security works in the cyber world. First, we have to be aware that there is a number of security properties that are not all the same that we need to be aware of. The very first thing that is obvious is confidentiality. If I send to B a message, I may need that this message is kept secret. I would not like everybody to know it, for example, because I'm giving instructions on how to open something or how to start a machine somewhere, and I would like this to remain secret. So this is called confidentiality. Beyond this, there are other things we may want. One of them is related to the ability by an attacker, by a bad guy, to modify a message. If I send a message from A to B, even if the message is encrypted and impossible to read and understand by an attacker, perhaps an attacker could still do things about the message, could alter the message, modify some of the fields, or replay a message. For example, I send to you, open the door, but I sent this to you 2 weeks ago. If an attacker can replay the message and say to you, open the door now, then you might open the door, but not to me, perhaps to an attacker here. So this is called integrity and authenticity, making sure that a message that you receive is really coming from the person that pretends to be the sender, and that the message you receive is exactly as it was sent by the person that is sending it. A more sophisticated desirable property is non-repudiation. That's a different topic. Here, assume A says to B, please sell this amount of stuff. Then B sells it, and then A realizes the price was not good, and then A can say, oh, but I never told you to sell this. Then B has a problem here. So this problem is avoided if we have what is called non-repudiation. If having done something, it's impossible for you to pretend that you did not do it. This is in a context where we have different companies or different players that are not necessarily cooperative here. So those are the desirable properties. We will see how the classical technical cryptographic means that are used today are deployed to achieve all of these properties. While achieving this, we need to be aware that there are possible adversaries, attackers, the bad guy here. The bad guy can be passive in the worst case, so it may be somebody who's just listening without modifying any message. Of course, the bad guy will not remain passive forever. The goal of a passive attacker is to become active later, but part of an attack may involve a purely passive phase, and we may want to avoid this. For example, if a PMU is sending information to a PDC, we could say, well, we don't care, there's nothing secret about this, but still an attacker could gain, who has full access to all the information you send, can gain information about all the state of your grid, and could use that later to mount an attack. For example, could decide when to do an attack based on the state of the grid. Some attacks are more feasible when the grids are in some states. So passive attackers should not be overlooked. A passive attacker might be a threat because it's the preparation of a later attack. Of course, there are also Active attackers are attackers that manipulate the messages to change the content to make you do things that you were not intended to do. So let's start with the first cybersecurity mechanism, which is symmetric cryptography. So symmetric cryptography is used everywhere. Whenever you access an HTTPS site, whenever we use TLS, which most of the web transactions do today, we use symmetric cryptography. So how does symmetric cryptography work? Okay, sorry for this little interruption. So the goal of symmetric cryptography, used in the way that I'm showing here, is to provide confidentiality. So somebody wants to send a message. The message, the jargon of cryptography is written here. Plain text means a message, the true message that you want to send, and is not encrypted. In order to encrypt the plain text, we use a key. In this setting, the plain text is secret. We want to have confidentiality. That means I want to send a message and keep it secret to anybody except the intended receiver. To do this, I use cryptography, symmetric cryptography, that requires to have a key, a secret key also. Then some algorithmic code will transform the plain text combined with the key into something encrypted, which is called a ciphertext. The notation is here, E sub K of P, that means the encryption of P, the plain text, with the key C. And that gives us an encrypted text. If you watch an encrypted text with a text editor, you will just see arbitrary bits, so that will display it with hexadecimal digits, so that doesn't look like a text at all. And the idea is that this gives you no information. Having this is as good as having nothing in the ideal case. Then what do you do with this text? In order to be able to read it, you need to have the key. Now the key is the same for decrypting and encrypting. So if you know the secret, you can apply a decryption algorithm and recover the plain text here. For this to work, of course, we need that the key is secret, and symmetric cryptography is called symmetric because the key is the same for encrypting and for decrypting. Okay. Here is an example of a historical symmetric cryptography system that is about 2,000 years old. Before computers, the Roman army was very well organized and had to send messages. So Julius Caesar used a cryptographic system. I see messages here. So we have 3 people waiting in the waiting room. Welcome to them, and try to catch up. Here is an example of a symmetric cipher. Very simple. It consists in shifting the letters of the alphabet. So assume we have an alphabet with the Roman alphabet, 26 letters. The key, okay, I will mute some of the newcomers. Well, I muted everyone. If you need to speak, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. Otherwise, you can also use the chat to send me information. So here, if the key is 3, it simply means I shift every letter by 3 positions. So A becomes D, B becomes E, etc. So AVE, Ave, becomes DYH. So this is a Roman word, a Latin word. This is garbage in Latin. So let's see what happens when we encrypt a message. Assume Julius Caesar has sent to you this message. You are a soldier or a captain working in Helvetia, and you receive this message. You know the secret key that was sent to you perhaps by somebody on a horse, or you had it when you left Rome. And the problem is, can you find this message? If you know the secret key, of course you will do. But if you are an attacker, could you still decrypt it? This is our first speak up test. So I will open another speak up poll. And on your speak up screen, you should see the possibility to send 1 out of 5 answers. So let's take a few minutes to find out what Julius Caesar was saying to us. Oops. I close the poll now. As soon as I can. Okay, speak up doesn't work for me here. So I will not see your answers, but I will give the answer now. The answer is the third one, tu quoque fili. But we see that we were able to decrypt this message by doing what I call here a brute force attack. If I try all the keys, I obtain those 26 possible messages. And then because it's a clear text message, I can look for what message makes sense in Latin. And I found there's only one, which is this one here. So this message, this is not a very good cryptographic system. There's multiple reasons. One of them is that the key is not large enough. We have a key which is a shift between 0 and 25. So this is not strong enough because you can try all the different shifts by brute force, even if you don't have a computer, and then you would find the message. So Caesar was not very smart, but at that time, not many people knew how to read and write. So I guess that was good enough at that time. Today, schemes use much, much larger keys. For example, one of the schemes that we will briefly introduce, AES, which is a standard scheme used today, uses a key of size of typically 200 bits. Now, if you have 200 or even 100 bits, the number of possible keys is given here. It is 10 with 38 zeros. So it's a huge number. Some people say it's the number of atoms in the universe. So even with all very powerful computers, trying all possible combinations would exhaust you. So that's the first thing that, of course, we will need to be aware of. When we use symmetric cryptography, we will have to use keys, and the keys have to be large. The scheme that is very, very often used for symmetric cryptography is one of the variants of AES. AES, called Advanced Encryption Standard, is a block cipher. A block cipher, that means it takes a plain text that must be of a fixed size, 128 bits, like an IPv6 address, so 16 hexadecimal digits. And then it is translated 32 hexadecimal digits, which is translated into a ciphertext of the same size. Now, what do you do if you have a true text? Then chances are it will not be a multiple of this. So first you chop it into blocks of the size 128 bits, and you add padding at the end to make it the correct size. So this is how we can view AES. AES takes as input a block of 128-bit. How many such blocks are there? 2 to the power 128. And then it gives as output something that appears to be a random permutation. Of course, it's not random. It's completely deterministic, because if it would be random, we would not be able to decrypt, right? It has to be non-random. But if you don't know the key, it appears to be random. That's the trick of cryptography. Anyone who doesn't know the secret has no information. That means the information, the message that it sees, the encrypted message that you see, appears to be purely random here. Every key gives a different permutation, but if you do a bit of computation with 128 or even 256 length keys, you have much fewer keys than there are possible permutations. So it is a subset of the number of all possible permutations. How does AES really work? Well, I will not give it in detail, but you can easily find some details by going on to Wikipedia. Here is a drawing I copied from Dan Bonnet, who is a cryptographer. It does a number of things that consist in a number of stages. So from the key, it uses the key to create a number of intermediate keys by shuffling and applying operation on the key. Remember, the key is your secret here. Then you use the key here to do things like randomly shuffle the message. So you write the message into a matrix and then you shuffle it, a bit like you do when you play cards and you shuffle the cards before starting to play here. So the take-home message here is AES tries to do something that is completely ad hoc, and there is no formal proof that this is really secret. The only proof that we have is that all cryptographers in the world have, or all cryptanalysts have tried to break it and did not manage so far. So it is believed, but not mathematically proven, that AES cannot be broken. That means that anybody who doesn't know the key cannot understand anything of the message, cannot guess how the permutation was done here. So we say that it's immune to known plaintext attacks. But there is still an attack that we could do, which is a bit the attack that I mentioned before, which is to replay a message that was sent before. Messages sent by systems are very often the same. So if you see a message that has generated a sequence of message, M1, M2, Mn, and if you don't see them, you could trigger the system to generate them. Then you will encrypt it with your secret key and obtain ciphertext CI. But if you're an adversary, you can know if you were able to generate the plaintext, so this is called a chosen plaintext attack, then you know the pairs. You know that this message here was encrypted into this ciphertext. Now, assume you see ciphertext number 3, then you know that the message was M3 here. Now you could say, well, what is the probability that you have seen exactly a plaintext? Well, that happens because there are many fields that are known. For example, when I send an IP packet, there are lots of things in the packets that are protocol headers that are easy to guess here. So the problem is that because with a scheme like we have seen here, the same block, the same plaintext, is always encrypted to the same ciphertext that can be used to gain information. So this is our first step into understanding that having a secret cryptography mechanism is not sufficient. What do we do to defeat this problem? Well, we use what is called a nonce. A nonce is some text that is on purpose different whenever you use the encryption mechanism. So it solves the problem of the fact that we have a block cipher. How does it work? As before, I have a plaintext P to send. I have a secret key and I want to encrypt it. But before encrypt it, I will mix the text with a message N, which doesn't have to be secret, so it can be public, completely predictable. But the hope is that by mixing the P with N, we obtain things that are very different and once encrypted, that are impossible to infer. So we will encrypt, send it. The bad guy will see a sequence of messages, of encrypted messages that are all different because the nonce has to be different at every time here. So we will not see M3 multiple times. So even if the same text is sent several times, the C here will be different. Of course, when you decrypt, you need to know exactly the nonce. This is why the nonce are typically public or easily computable here. With AES, there are two classical ways of doing that. I don't know why there are two, but it would be simpler if there would be only one. The first one is called CBC, blockchaining. It consists in saying, I use a random vector, initialization vector, a random nonce. So it is simply a string of bits that has the same sign as a block. You choose it randomly, but it's not secret. You give it to your destination here. And then whenever you have to encrypt something, you first XOR with the message you have to encrypt. XOR means for every bit of the message, you apply the XOR operation. XOR is a binary operation on bits that transforms a bit by taking the corresponding bits of M1 and IV of the initialization vector. And this is this transform thing that you encrypt, that gives you C1. Of course, in order to decrypt, you need, when you receive C1, you need to have the initialization vector. And then we chain things. We use the encrypted block as the equivalent of the initialization vector as the nonce for the next block here. So when M2 is encrypted, before encrypting it, we XOR with C1 and we chain this here. When you decrypt, of course, you must have the initialization vector and you must be sure that there is no mistake anywhere. If C1 is corrupted, for example, you will not be able to decrypt the rest. But with high probability, the C1, C2, C3 that you obtain are completely random. So they are, when we use them as nonces, they are completely random. And if M2 is equal to M1, or if M3 is equal to M1, then C3 with overwhelming probability will be very different from C1 or C2 here. So that achieves the purpose. That's called CBC. There are different ways to do it. Instead of doing that, you could do a simpler thing. You start a counter and you say, for every block, I increment the counter by 1. And that is what I use then I encrypt this counter, which gives me something that appears to be completely random. And I do the XOR of my message with this random thing here. So we're using here a simple fact that the simplest way to encrypt a message is to XOR it with a key. If I have only one message to send and I have a key that has the same size as the message, that is secret and is used only once, then that's the best you can do in terms of cryptography. So we use the same idea here, but we apply it with the counter, which is encrypted. It's encrypted with a key here. So of course, somebody who doesn't have the key has the impression that this is a completely random number. When you decrypt, you receive C1. Then you must know the counter. So for decrypting, you recompute the encryption of the counter plus 1, and you XOR with C1 to obtain M1. XOR has the property that if I XOR A with B, and if I XOR the result with B, I obtain A. So plus is equal to minus. XORing is the inverse of itself. So this is how, in practice, AES CBC and AES CTR are used here. So to recap, those are symmetric encryption schemes. They are the most frequently used today. They require key sizes that are at least 128 bits. Why we use them is because they are very fast. They don't do sophisticated mathematical applications. They just randomly shuffle columns and rows in matrix representation of the data. And we believe today they provide confidentiality if you don't have the key. In the past, there was something like AES that was called DES that was used for many, many decades, that used a 56-bit key and was broken. It was believed to be secure for a long period of time. Then some cryptanalysts found a way to break it. It was not a very easy way to break it, but there were hidden dependencies between messages. If a sequence of messages has been encrypted with DES with the same key, you could do combinations of these messages to predict the encryption of the combination. They were like linear properties that were surviving the encryption, so it was broken. What happened when it was broken? Well, it was made public that it's broken, and you had to very quickly change all the software that was using DES here. So this leads us to this very important statement. Encryption software, or even hardware, it's a problem in fact if we do encryption in hardware, should have the capability to choose an encryption method and to change it. So if I download a web browser, by the time my web browser is developed, they make some assumptions on security, so they ship it with some security mechanisms. But by the time I receive it, I install it and I run it, I may need to change the encryption mechanism. So I may need to do an update of my software to change the encryption mechanism. In fact, the overwhelming number of reasons why software is updated every week is security issues. Some security issues have to do with cryptography. Some other security issues have to do with the code that is itself revealing information and has to be modified. But the take-home message is, whenever you use software, you must use encryption. And when you use encryption, you must make sure that you have the most up-to-date version. Otherwise, it might be using something that is broken. What could happen if you use some software that is broken? Of course, the bad guys, their job is to use broken encryption mechanism to gain access to computers. For example, in the past, there were known cases of an attack against your cellular telephone, your smartphone, by setting up a base station, a fake base station that uses broken encryption mechanism and asks your smartphone software to choose this encryption method. Typically, when two computers or when two devices connect, there is a negotiation phase. You must use an encryption mechanism that is supported by both. That's the bad thing about encryption. If things would be simple, like there is in the internet, there is IPv4 or IPv6, there is TCP or QUIC, and there are not zillions of other variants. So every system supports all of them. In cryptography, it's more complicated. You have Internet of Things objects that may support some encryption mechanism and not others, and there are plenty of them. Of course, that's a major concern. If you support only systems that are no longer secure, and if you're the system you're talking to accepts this because it has been poorly patched or it's using a version of Linux that's 2 years old, then you may be using a cryptographic system that is not safe, that is not secure. So take-home message, we need to make sure that the software is always updated. So let's do a little quiz if SpeakUp is working better now. my speak up doesn't work here. I suspect the speak up server is down. We will do without speak up. So I'm proposing here two possible statements. AES is a block cipher that encrypts blocks of 128 bits, and AES is invertible for who knows the key. Think about it and try to find which of the statements are true. Now speak up is up again. So you can use speak up to give your answers. I see lots of answers coming in. I close the poll in 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see on your speak up screen, the majority is C, which is the correct answer. This is the correct answer. It encrypts blocks of 128 bits, and if you know the key, you can encrypt it. Of course, you can decrypt it, so of course, it must be invertible. Here. Another question, when using a non-space encryption schemes, I propose 3 statements. Which of them do you think are correct? So I see a number of answers. Number is growing. I close the poll in a few seconds. When using speak up, if you change your mind, you can give the answer again, and only the last answer is taken. And I should have mentioned that perhaps before, it's completely anonymous. So I don't see who gave which answer with speak up. That's the idea of speak up. That's to favor communication. So you can say whatever you think is correct. I don't know what you said. The goal is to encourage participation. In contrast, when you send something on the chat group of the Zoom, I see who says what, right? Just to make things clear. So let me close the poll. And we see that there is a tie between a variety of answers. The correct answer is C, is D, A and B. A and B are correct. So a nonce should never be used more than once in combination with the same key. In principle, yes, because that's the goal of the nonce, is to make sure that the same block, when repeatedly encrypted, should not appear as the same ciphertext. A nonce need not be secret. This is true. And in fact, in practice, it is not secret because the destination must know it in order to decrypt. It must be random. We've seen no, not necessarily. In fact, in the AES CTR scheme, the nonce is completely deterministic, except for the first value. It's a counter. So the hope is that combined with the encryption, that will produce random results. Voila, those are the answers. We will stop here for the lecture itself for today. So next week, we will see the other cryptographic building blocks. in particular message authentication code and asymmetric cryptography. But I think for today, for this first experiment, we've done enough, so we will stop here. I would just like to encourage you to raise your hand if there is anything you want to say. If there's any feedback on how the course went this morning, please don't hesitate to say. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think we'll need to do that for a number of weeks. So we're putting things in place. Don't hesitate to give your feedback now. We'll be happy to do whatever makes all of us as efficient as possible.